Trump says Chinese President Xi Jinping will visit Washington at the end of September. The leaders of the world's two largest economies last met in May during a summit in Beijing. At that meeting, they agreed to try and stabilize relations. And China has test-fired a long-range ballistic missile in the South Pacific. Images released by Chinese state media show the weapon was fired from a submarine. The test caused alarm in the Pacific. Australia, Japan, and New Zealand all criticized this launch. Beijing insists it complied with international law. NATO Secretary General says the launch sends a clear message to the alliance.
We cannot be naive about China. You know this. And this is why we have this close cooperation. Because the theaters are getting more and more intertwined, connected. What happens in the Pacific is relevant to what is happening in the transatlantic. And we see it also in the war with Ukraine, where China, North Korea and Iran are key enablers of Russia's unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine.
Let's bring in Richard Weitz, a senior fellow at the NATO Defense College, joining us live from Washington, D.C. Richard, Mark Rutte there calling China one of the key enablers in Russia's war on Ukraine. How do you think NATO should analyze China's military ambitions and geopolitical actions here?
Well, China is seeking to, and to all appearance succeeding in, becoming the world's second most powerful military country globally and rivaling the United States as a potential peer competitor in Asia. But the Europeans are correct in that China also can have capabilities that will threaten European security. In principle, the Europeans are vulnerable to, for example, the kind of missiles, the long-range missiles that China tested. But more concretely, it's through China's assistance to Russia that's sustaining the Ukraine war. Some of that is military assistance. There have been reports of training. The Chinese give the Russians components that they can then insert inside their missiles to substitute for Western sanctions goods. But simply by buying all the oil from Russia, supporting Russia in diplomatic forums like the UN, China is certainly enabling Russia to continue a war that it might have stopped by now.
So what does that mean for NATO operations? Should these Chinese actions warrant any kind of proactive steps from NATO?
I think, given the geographic realities, what we'll probably see is the Europeans becoming more comfortable with the announced U.S. troop withdrawals and repositioning of forces and assets to the Pacific theater. We saw some alarm earlier this year, or at least a concern, when the U.S. started announcing some of these withdrawals. But I think the rationale has become clearer. The Europeans are trying to step in and fill the gaps where they can. In some cases, that's not possible, but many it is. So I think the Europeans and NATO can provide certainly diplomatic support at the summit, but their best function is to help backfill for the kind of capabilities the U.S. is now repositioning from Europe to the Pacific and sometimes the Middle East.
You mentioned this U.S. troop withdrawal. Trump has been calling for a NATO 3.0, an alliance that shifts from sort of a burden sharing to more heavily relying on those European allies. How do you think that should change or will change the way that NATO operates?
Well, it is changing in the sense of the capabilities that are being provided. The Europeans now are providing the lead assistance to Ukraine much more than the United States, at least in terms of concrete platforms and munitions. The U.S. still provides certain unique capabilities, such as intelligence. The Europeans are thinking about some wider security issues that involve the Pacific. They have partners in the form of Japan, South Korea, Australia. And we've seen a Secretary General who understands the interconnectedness of the European and Asian theaters. It's not only China. We've seen the North Koreans actually deploy military forces inside Europe. And meanwhile, Iran has also provided some assistance for the Russian invasion, at least earlier So the Europeans are being forced, even if they focus on the European threat of Ukraine against Ukraine, to think broader than the European theater and how countries based in the Middle East and especially Asia can threaten them indirectly through the support they provide Russia.
Russia, though, has certainly been seen by many as NATO's biggest threat, with the U.S. even warning Poland that Moscow might attack. For you guys at the NATO Defense College, how do you assess this threat from Russia? Is an attack likely in the near future?
You know, 5 years ago, I would have said no, but at this point, I'm because of these warnings, because of Russian frustration about recent Ukrainian successes, these long-range strikes, I agree that we need to worry about the defense of Poland, the Baltics. An outright invasion, maybe not, but certainly we're going to have probably we're going to see more cases of drones overflying into Poland and the Baltic states and Romania. We'll see Belarus and Russia exercise more. We'll see more forward positioning of Russian forces so that they can engage in a more rapid attack. So it's a much more dire environment, even without an actual Russian invasion of a NATO country.
Richard, given everything that's going on in the world, do you think that NATO should stay as a collective defense alliance, only acting if one member is attacked, or should it have a broader scope here, acting in conflicts beyond its own territory?
Well, NATO has worked out, I think, a reasonable balance. Its focus has been on defending European countries from external military attack from Russia. But the alliance has engaged much more broadly in terms of reaching out to the Pacific countries, working on common doctrine and exchanging insights. It supported counterterrorism missions in Africa and earlier the Middle East. Meanwhile, the alliance does not preclude some of its members being more directly engaged in encountering some of these threats. So at various points we've seen coalitions of the willing backing U.S. military operations in the Middle East or Africa. We've seen several of the European countries take out have greater activities in the Pacific in terms of sending their warships. So I think it's a reasonable balance where we are now.
Richard White's a senior fellow at the NATO Defense College, live from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, Richard, for your time.